If someone had told you that a wedding could be destroyed by a single slap, you probably would not believe them. Neither did the bride, until the pastor's hand moved through the air and struck the groom across the face, not in anger, not in madness, but with the quiet, deliberate weight of a man who had run out of any other option. In that single instant, inside a church packed with more than 200 guests, the happiest day of Elsie's life cracked down the middle. And what crawled out of that crack was a truth so long buried that even the man who buried it had almost convinced himself it was gone. Before we start, if you love powerful African stories, filled with emotion, mystery, and real-life lessons, then make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. And I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Are you watching from the United States, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, South Africa, or somewhere else entirely? I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel across the world. Now, let's begin. The church fell completely silent. Not the polite silence of a congregation preparing to pray. The breathless, frozen silence of people who have just witnessed something they will be trying to explain for the rest of their lives. Then Pastor Matthew looked the groom in the eyes. His voice, when he finally used it, was so quiet that the people in the front rows had to lean forward to catch the words. He said, "I cannot bless a marriage that is standing on a truth that has been left unfinished." 200 people stopped breathing at the same time. Some stared at the pastor. Others looked at the groom. A few turned toward the bride, as though she might have an explanation that the rest of them lacked. She didn't. Elsie remained exactly where she had been standing when the world changed. 5 steps from the altar, bouquet trembling in both hands, veil catching the morning light that was still pouring through the stained glass as if nothing had happened. Only seconds earlier, she had been waiting to hear the most beautiful words she had imagined since the evening Paul proposed. Instead, she watched the man that everyone in this building respected and trusted raise his hand and strike the man she had given 4 years of her life to. The sound of it had echoed once and then seemed to hang in the air, refusing to leave. No one rushed toward the altar. No one shouted. No one pulled out a phone. The silence itself felt louder than anything anyone could have shouted. Paul slowly lifted his head. A mark had already begun to appear on his cheek, faint but visible, and still he made no move to defend himself. He did not protest. He did not demand an explanation. He did not look toward his groomsmen for support. He simply lowered his eyes toward the floor. And that stillness was what terrified Elsie more than anything else in the room. She had known Paul for 4 years. She had seen him navigate difficult clients at work without raising his voice. She had watched him stay composed through arguments that would have broken other men. She had sat beside him in hospital waiting rooms and watched him hold himself together when falling apart would have been completely reasonable. But she had never, not once in 4 years, seen him accept humiliation without a word. If he believed something was wrong, he said so, calmly, clearly, without dramatics. But he always said so. The fact that he was saying nothing told her something far more frightening than anything the pastor had spoken. It told her that Paul understood why this was happening. She searched his face for confusion, for the flash of anger that would confirm a misunderstanding, for something, anything, that would tell her that the man she was about to marry was as surprised by this moment as she was. What she found instead, she had never seen on his face in 4 years together. Guilt. Not the guilt of someone caught doing something shameful in the present. The guilt of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just watched it arrive at the exact moment they hoped it never would. Pastor Matthew's hand returned slowly to his side. There was no satisfaction on his face, no righteous anger, no triumph. What was there, what every person in that sanctuary could read clearly, was sorrow. Deep, unmistakable, long-held sorrow. The kind that belongs to a man who has been praying all morning that he would not have to do what he just did. His voice, when he spoke again, was measured and deliberate. "Call." He paused long enough for the name to settle. "I asked you this morning, before we entered this sanctuary together." Whether there was anything that Elsie deserved to know before she made a promise that would shape every remaining day of her life. Paul closed his eyes. The pastor continued, "I asked because I wanted to protect this marriage, not interrupt it. Protect it." Another silence filled the room like water. "And you told me there was nothing?" Elsie's heart moved in a way she had no name for. She looked from the pastor to the groom. From the groom, back to the pastor. "What is he talking about?" Her voice came out softer than she intended, barely above a whisper. Paul looked at her. Their eyes met for 3 full seconds. In those 3 seconds, Elsie read everything she had not been told. He knew. Whatever the pastor was speaking about, Paul already knew. He had known before he walked down that aisle. He had known before the flowers were arranged and the guests were seated. He had known before she stood in front of a mirror that morning and told her bridesmaids, with complete certainty, that she did not have a single doubt. And he had chosen silence. Every single time. The morning had started so beautifully that no one could have imagined, standing in the car park, taking photographs and greeting relatives, that it would end with a wedding standing completely still. The church had been prepared with the kind of care that takes days and shows for hours. Fresh flowers lined both sides of the aisle in long, deliberate rows, white roses and soft greenery arranged in a way that turned an ordinary building into something that felt sacred. Sunlight came through the stained glass windows on both sides and painted the polished wooden floor in long pools of amber and gold and deep violet. The colors shifted slowly as the morning progressed, moving across the floor like something alive. Volunteers had been arriving since before 7 in the morning. Programs were counted, stacked, straightened. Candles were tested. Ribbons were tied, untied, and tied again until they fell exactly right. Outside, the atmosphere was the warm, generous noise of a family gathering. Old friends calling to each other across the car park, aunties pulling cousins into hugs that went on longer than necessary, grandparents moving carefully but deliberately toward the entrance steps, dressed in their finest things. Children ran across the church lawn until their parents caught them by the collar. A photographer worked the entrance steps, capturing candid moments before the ceremony had even begun. If you had walked through those doors that morning knowing nothing, you would have felt only one thing. This was going to be a perfect wedding. Nobody knew that before the first vow was spoken, one envelope sitting on a desk in the pastor's office would change everything that happened next. Paul had arrived nearly 2 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. That was not unusual for him. He had always believed, in the quiet, principled way he operated, that arriving early on important days was a form of respect, a way of telling the occasion and the people involved that what was about to happen mattered enough to prepare for properly. He greeted every volunteer by name. He helped carry chairs from the storage room without being asked, making 2 extra trips when he noticed one of the older ushers struggling. When a younger volunteer couldn't get a decorative ribbon to sit right on the end pew, Paul crouched beside him and held one side steady while the young man worked. He did it without drawing attention to himself, without making the young man feel small, without saying anything more than a quiet, "There you go." It was the kind of behavior that made rooms feel more settled, simply because he was in them. One of the senior ushers caught him on his 3rd trip from the storage room and shook his head with a grin. "You're making the rest of us look terrible," the usher said. Paul smiled. "I'm just keeping myself busy." "Nervous?" "A little." The usher laughed. "If I were the one getting married today, I would be hiding behind the building." Paul said, "I was trying not to use the word terrified." They laughed together. It was the kind of small, forgettable exchange that disappears from memory within an hour on most ordinary days. But several people who had spoken to Paul during those early preparations would find themselves returning to that morning later, trying to match the man they had seen laughing easily in the church corridor with the man who had stood perfectly still and accepted a slap without a word. What most of them remembered afterward was that Paul had seemed lighter than usual. Not happy nervous in the way grooms typically are. Lighter. As though something he had been carrying for a long time was finally close to being set down. Across town, in a hotel suite 2 kilometers from the church, Elsie stood in front of a full-length mirror while her closest friends made the final adjustments to her dress. She had been smiling for more than an hour. Not the polite, performed smile of someone posing for photographs. The real, unguarded smile of a woman who has arrived, finally, at the day she has been quietly building toward for years. Her maid of honor stepped back to look at the full picture and pressed her lips together. She made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sigh. "You look like something from a film," she finally said. Elsie laughed. "Don't make me cry before we've even left the hotel." Another bridesmaid asked, "Any last-minute doubts?" Elsie answered without hesitation and without looking away from her own reflection. Not one single one. The room filled with the warm, generous laughter of women who had been through enough together to appreciate this moment for exactly what it was. Someone opened a bottle of sparkling water and poured it into glasses. They toasted quietly. Elsie walked to the small table near the window where a framed photograph had been sitting since the previous evening. It had been taken the previous autumn beside a quiet lake outside the city. She and Paul had driven there on a Saturday afternoon with no particular plan, which was unusual for Paul, who had a plan for most things. But that Saturday he had said only, "Let's just drive and see where we end up." And they had ended up at the lake. Neither of them was looking at the camera in the photograph. They were looking at each other. A bridesmaid had taken it without either of them knowing, which was why it was Elsie's favorite. Nothing about it had been posed. Nothing had been arranged. It had simply happened. "You always keep that one close," a bridesmaid noted. "It reminds me of something," Elsie said. "What?" She smiled at the photograph. "That love doesn't always come with fireworks and announcements. Sometimes it arrives quietly, and quietly becomes the safest place you have ever known." She set the frame back on the table. At that moment, standing in her wedding dress with sunlight coming through the hotel window, she believed every word of it. She had no reason not to. Back at the church, Pastor Matthew sat alone in his office while the building came alive around him. He had been using this pre-ceremony silence the same way for nearly 30 years. He sat quietly. He prayed for the couple. He asked for patience and wisdom and honesty to anchor what the day was building. It was a ritual as familiar to him as breathing. It had never once failed to bring him peace before a ceremony began. Today it was failing. Something was sitting inside him that refused to be prayed away. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." His assistant entered with the morning's post. "Mostly congratulations cards," she said, smiling as she placed the small stack on the corner of his desk. She was already turning to leave when she paused. "Oh, there was one more." It wasn't with the others. She reached back into the delivery bag and produced a plain white envelope. No stamp, no return address. No decorative handwriting, only 3 words printed with careful, deliberate neatness across the front. "For Pastor Matthew." She frowned slightly. "I almost set it aside because I didn't recognize the writing." He accepted it with a calm smile. "I'm sure it's nothing to worry about." She left and pulled the door closed softly behind her. The office returned to silence. Pastor Matthew looked down at the envelope. It weighed almost nothing, but something about holding it felt wrong. He had spent enough years in rooms with people during the hardest moments of their lives to recognize when an ordinary-looking thing was carrying something extraordinary inside it. He opened it carefully. Inside were 3 items: a folded letter on plain white paper, an old photograph, worn slightly at the edges as though it had been handled many times, and a smaller sealed envelope with a single sentence written on its front in the same careful hand. "Open only if Paul refuses to tell the truth." The pastor's expression changed. He unfolded the letter. He read the first paragraph slowly, then the second. He reached the end of the page and set it flat on the desk. He pressed both palms against the surface and closed his eyes. In 30 years of ministry, very little had genuinely surprised him. This letter did. He picked up the photograph next. It showed a younger version of Paul standing outside a small church. Dark suit, tie slightly crooked in the way of men who refuse help with their ties. Beside him stood a woman in a simple but beautiful white dress. Her hair was swept up. She was laughing. The kind of laugh that belongs to a moment just before a photograph is taken, when something unexpected has happened and nobody has had time to compose their face yet. Their hands were woven together. Not self-consciously. Not because a photographer had instructed them. The way people hold hands when they have stopped noticing that they are doing it. They looked happy. Not performed happy. The real kind. The kind that belongs to two people who have stopped pretending and are simply living inside the life they chose. Pastor Matthew turned the photograph over. On the back, in the same careful hand, 6 words. Some promises deserve one more truth. He stared at the sentence for a long time. Then he set the photograph down and looked toward the window. Below, guests were arriving. Families walking up the path together. A group of women laughing at something one of them had just said. A young couple trying to manage a toddler who wanted to walk in the exact opposite direction of everyone else. Every person climbing those steps believed they were about to witness the beginning of a beautiful story. Only one man in the entire building now knew that before a single vow could be spoken, a very different kind of conversation needed to happen first. He picked up the smaller sealed envelope. Read the instruction on its front one more time. Open only if Paul refuses to tell the truth. He held it in both hands and whispered very quietly to the empty room. Please, tell me this isn't what I think it is. Paul had just finished rearranging the final row of chairs at the back of the sanctuary when he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned. Pastor Matthew stood close. His expression was calm. But there was something in his eyes that Paul had never seen there in all the years he had known this man. Seriousness. The particular kind that does not leave room for pleasantries. Do you have a few minutes? Paul smiled. Of course. I'd like to speak with you privately. Paul assumed it was the pre-ceremony prayer, a tradition. A final moment of grounding before the vows. He followed the pastor without hesitation through the narrow corridor behind the sanctuary, past the small room where the programs were stored, down to the office at the far end. Once inside, Pastor Matthew closed the door. He walked to his desk. He picked up the plain white envelope and placed it on the surface between them. Paul looked at it. His smile disappeared. What is that? I was hoping you might be able to tell me. Something cold moved through Paul's chest. He did not recognize the envelope, but he recognized the feeling that had just arrived inside him. The feeling of something that has been running in the opposite direction for a long time, suddenly choosing to stop and turn around. I don't understand, he said carefully. This arrived this morning. It concerns you directly. I haven't spoken to anyone else about it. I came to you first because I believed that was the right thing to do. Paul said, quietly, Thank you. I don't want thanks. I want honesty. The room became very still. Outside the closed door, the distant sound of laughter moved through the building as another group of guests arrived. Inside, neither man moved. The pastor opened the envelope. He removed the photograph. Without a word, without introduction or explanation, he placed it face up on the desk between them. Paul looked at it. The color drained from his face. Not gradually, all at once, like a candle being extinguished. He stared at the image for several long seconds without speaking. You recognize it, the pastor said. It was not a question. Paul closed his eyes. Yes. Who is she? The answer arrived in the narrow space between a breath and a word. My wife. The office became so still that the clock on the wall seemed to tick louder. Pastor Matthew gave him time. He had learned, across decades of sitting with people in the most difficult moments of their lives, that some silences need to be respected before they can be challenged. Paul corrected himself. Was, the pastor repeated. She died. The 2 words arrived slowly, each one carrying weight that a short sentence should not have been able to hold. I'm sorry, Pastor Matthew said. So am I. The silence returned. Then the pastor asked the question that changed the direction of everything that followed. When were you planning to tell Elsie? Paul's breath stopped. His lips parted slightly. No answer came. The pastor asked again, his voice still measured and unhurried. When, Paul? The answer that arrived was the most honest and the most painful thing Paul had said all morning. I don't know. The pastor looked at him steadily. You don't know. Paul looked at the photograph. Every time I tried, I stopped myself. Why? because every time I imagined saying her name out loud to Elsie, I could already see what would happen next. I could see Elsie's face change. I could see the question forming behind her eyes, the one she would never say aloud but would never stop thinking. Am I second? Have I always been second? Is this man still living inside someone else's story? He paused. I never wanted her to spend a single day wondering whether she was competing with a memory. Pastor Matthew listened without interrupting. Paul continued. I loved Grace. When she died, I genuinely believed that part of my heart was simply gone. Closed. Finished. I didn't hide this from Elsie to deceive her. I hid it because I was afraid. Because I loved her, and I was afraid that if she knew the whole truth, I would lose her before I had the chance to show her that she had the whole of me. The pastor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I believe you. Paul looked up. You do? I do. But believing the reason behind a decision is not the same as agreeing with the decision. Paul lowered his head. The pastor lifted the letter from the desk. There's something else in here. It says your silence was not only about grief. It says you made Grace a promise. Before she died, Paul went completely still. He did not move. He did not blink. He did not speak. And that silence confirmed everything the letter had claimed. Is it true? Paul's voice came out barely audible. Yes. What was the promise? I can't tell you. Why not? Because I gave her my word. The pastor's voice remained completely calm. And today you are standing here preparing to give another woman your word. Paul closed his eyes. That sentence reached somewhere that most words do not reach. The pastor walked to the window. Below, the church garden was filling with arriving guests. A photographer adjusted something on his camera near the entrance. Two elderly men were greeting each other with the kind of handshake that lasts a long time and says more than words can. Without turning around, Pastor Matthew spoke. If Elsie learns this truth after she has already married you, will she thank you for protecting her? He paused. Or will she ask why you didn't trust her enough to let her make the decision herself? Paul stood in the silence that followed that question. He stood in it for a long time, because the answer had always been there. He had simply spent years refusing to look directly at it. When Paul stepped back into the main sanctuary, the church looked exactly as it had before. Guests settling into pews, children being redirected to their seats, the warm, anticipatory noise of a gathering that believes it is about to celebrate something. To everyone else in that building, it was still a perfect wedding morning. Only two men knew that the foundation had already shifted. Nathan found Paul in the side garden standing alone near the low stone wall, hands in his jacket pockets, staring at nothing in particular. He had known Paul for almost 10 years. He had been there through enough of Paul's quiet seasons to know the difference between ordinary nervousness and something heavier. What he saw on his best friend's face that morning was something heavier. You all right? He asked. Paul said, just nervous, a fraction too quickly. Nathan studied him without speaking for a moment. I've known you nearly a decade. I've watched you stay composed in rooms where other men were falling apart. I have never seen you look like this before, a good thing. Paul managed a small smile. I just want today to go well. Nathan put a hand on his shoulder. It will. You and Elsie are the real thing. Everyone in that building knows it. Paul looked away. I hope so. An usher appeared at the garden entrance. They were ready. Inside the bridal suite, Elsie had been alone for the first time all morning. Her bridesmaids had stepped out to organize the processional order, and she stood at the window, the city spread below her, going about its Saturday in complete indifference to what was about to unfold inside this room. She thought about Paul. Not his appearance, not the ceremony. She thought about the particular quality he had always carried, the way he was never somewhere he wasn't. The afternoon, he waited outside her office building in the rain with her forgotten umbrella. Not because she had asked, but because he had noticed it on the hall table when he left, and worked out that she would need it. The evening, he quietly assembled her grandmother's bookshelves without ever mentioning it afterward. Not to the grandmother and not to Elsie. Not until the old woman called to ask how the shelves had appeared in her sitting room. The day he canceled a Lagos business trip because Elsie's father had been admitted to hospital, then sat in a corridor chair for 6 hours because there weren't enough seats in the waiting room and he wanted Elsie to have a proper one. He had never made speeches. He had never tried to impress people with large gestures. He simply showed up, quietly, consistently, dependably. He showed up. That was why she trusted him. Not because he had never disappointed her, but because she had never, in 4 years, had any reason to doubt that his word meant what it said. A soft knock at the door. "Come in." Her father stepped inside. He was already red around the eyes, which he had promised her he would not be. "You look exactly like your mother did on our wedding day." She crossed the room and held him for a long time. When they separated, he took her hands. "Marriage is not about finding someone who never disappoints you," he said quietly. "It is about finding someone who tells you the truth, even when the truth is difficult. Because the truth, even when it hurts, is always the kindest thing one person can offer another." She smiled. "Paul is that kind of man," her father said. She answered without any hesitation at all. "He is." She believed every word of it. She had no reason not to. The music began. The bridesmaids processed first, then the groomsmen. Nathan took his position at Paul's left shoulder and leaned close. Too late to run. Paul managed a genuine laugh. "I was never planning to." Then the doors at the back of the church opened, and Elsie appeared. In that moment, Paul forgot the envelope. He forgot the photograph. He forgot the question in the pastor's office and the answer he had been unable to give honestly. He forgot all of it. And for a few completely unguarded seconds, there was only the woman walking toward him down an aisle lined with white roses and morning light. She was smiling through tears. He was smiling too. Her father placed her hand into his at the altar. "Take good care of her." "I will." The ceremony began. It was genuinely beautiful. Readings were shared, prayers were offered in voices that clearly meant them. Several guests were already reaching for handkerchiefs. And Paul allowed himself, in those moments, to believe that the conversation in the office was simply going to remain behind a closed door. He told himself that Pastor Matthew would understand, that there was still time to explain everything after, that the moment had passed. Then the pastor closed his Bible. He looked directly at Paul, and his voice dropped to a register that was impossible to mistake. "Before we continue, I must ask one final question." The church noticed the shift instantly. The warmth in the room tilted. Nathan frowned. Elsie tilted her head slightly. "Paul?" The pastor spoke slowly and without softening. "Is there anything at all, that would prevent you from standing before this woman with a completely honest heart today?" 200 people moved their eyes to Paul. He could feel each one. He looked at Elsie. She was smiling softly, completely unaware of what was happening behind his eyes. One sentence. That was all it would take. One honest sentence, and the truth would finally be out. Instead, Paul looked at Pastor Matthew and said, very quietly, "No." The word left his mouth. The pastor closed his eyes, as though he had just lost the prayer he had been praying since early that morning. When they opened again, there was no anger in them, only sorrow. He asked one final time, "Are you certain?" Paul looked at Elsie. She was still smiling, still trusting. He nodded. Yes. Pastor Matthew closed his Bible. The sound landed in the room like a door shutting on something that should have been left open. Several guests looked at each other. This was not part of any ceremony they had ever attended. Nathan stepped forward slightly, and then, before anyone had time to understand what was about to happen, the pastor stepped toward Paul. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I prayed you would not make me do this." His palm struck Paul's cheek. The sound cracked through the sanctuary. A woman in the front row pressed both hands to her mouth. 3 people rose instinctively from their pews. Nathan stepped forward sharply, but Pastor Matthew raised one hand, steady, not threatening, and the room, somehow, obeyed. Paul did not move. He did not reach for his face. He did not raise his voice. He stood with his eyes lowered, completely still. And that stillness frightened the room more than the slap had. Elsie's bouquet slipped from her fingers and landed softly on the floor. Pastor Matthew turned to face the congregation. He did not rush. He waited until every person in the room had their eyes on him. He waited until even the children had gone quiet. Then he spoke. "I have served this church for nearly 3 decades. I have celebrated weddings and buried loved ones. I have listened to confessions in this office that have never left it and never will. I have sat beside people during the best days of their lives and the worst days of their lives. He paused, and never, not once in all of those years, have I interrupted a wedding. The church held perfectly still. I prayed this morning would not become the first. He looked toward Elsie. My daughter, I want you to hear me clearly. This is not about shaming the man standing beside you. It is not about destroying what you have built together. It is about protecting your marriage. Because a wedding is one day. A marriage asks for a lifetime, and a lifetime cannot begin honestly if the foundation it is being built on contains a truth that has been deliberately kept from the person who has the greatest right to know it. Elsie's eyes filled. I don't understand, she said. I know. And that is precisely why I cannot continue. He walked to the small table beside the altar. He lifted the plain white envelope carefully. He carried it toward Elsie and placed it into her trembling hands. Before you promise this man the rest of your life, I believe you deserve to know who he was, before you decide who he will become beside you. Elsie looked down at the envelope. She had held difficult things before. Letters from doctors, letters from lawyers, letters from people who had waited too long to say something important. She had never been more afraid to open a piece of paper. She looked at Paul. What is inside this? He opened his mouth. Nothing came. She looked back at the envelope. With fingers that were barely steady, she broke the seal. The tearing sound was unusually loud in the silent church. She reached inside. The first thing she removed was the photograph. She held it in front of her and stared at it. A younger Paul, outside a small church. Dark suit. Beside him, a woman in a simple white dress. Her hair swept up, both of them laughing, their hands woven together, completely, undeniably happy. Elsie blinked. She looked at Paul, then at the photograph again. Who is she? Paul answered immediately. Her name was Grace. The word was, past tense. You were married to her. He nodded once. Yes. That single word moved through the sanctuary like something physical. Nathan, standing at the side of the altar, looked as though the floor had shifted under him. He had known Paul for 10 years. He had been at every birthday. He had helped Paul move house. He had sat with him through difficult seasons and celebrated good ones, and he had never, not once in all of that time, heard the name Grace. Elsie's voice did not rise. It became quieter, which was somehow worse. You were married before me. Yes, and you never once told me. Paul closed his eyes. No, she looked at him steadily. I told you everything, things I was ashamed of, things I had never said to another person. My fears, my failures. The years I spent making choices I am still making peace with. The version of myself I was before I understood what I actually wanted from life. She paused. I handed you every difficult part of me. And all this time, 4 years, Paul, you were carrying an entire marriage, an entire person, in complete silence. He took one careful step toward her. Please believe me, deceiving you was never the intention. She stepped back. Only once. But he noticed, and that small distance hurt him in a way the slap had not. Then what was the intention? She asked. I wanted you to know me, not who I was before, who I had become, who I am with you. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. I thought I did know you. 4 words. They moved through the church the way certain sentences do, landing in every person present, not just the one they were spoken to. Elsie unfolded the letter. She read it in silence, then looked up. This isn't from Grace. No, the pastor confirmed. It came from someone who knew both of you. There was no signature. Only the words, someone who has carried this burden long enough. She continued reading. The letter did not call Paul cruel. It did not accuse him of malice. It described, carefully and without judgment, a man who had loved deeply and then disappeared entirely into his own grief, who had walled off an entire chapter of his life and convinced himself that protecting the people he loved now meant erasing the people he had loved before. It explained that Grace had died after a long illness, and it explained that in her final hours she had asked Paul for a promise. A promise so private, so personal, so tightly held that almost no one outside that hospital room had known it existed. Elsie lowered the letter slowly. Is this true? Yes. What was the promise? Paul struggled. I cannot explain it in a single sentence. Then used 10. It is the hardest thing I have ever been asked to say out loud. She held the letter against her chest. And yet you were willing to stand at this altar and marry me without ever trying. Paul's eyes filled. I thought I was protecting you. From what? My past. She was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke with the careful, measured weight of someone choosing words that will have to carry a great deal. No, Paul. You were not protecting me from your past. You were deciding, without asking me, without trusting me, whether I was capable of carrying it with you. You made a choice that belonged to both of us, and you made it alone. Pastor Matthew closed his Bible gently. This is why I stopped the ceremony. Not because Paul was married before. Not because grief should disqualify a person from loving again, but because love cannot stand at an altar and ask for forever while withholding a truth that could change the other person's answer. No one in the room argued. Not even Paul, because he knew that every word was right. He had always known. Elsie placed the photograph carefully back into the envelope. Then she asked the question that had been building in her chest since the first moment she heard Grace's name. If Grace died years ago, why is a promise made at a deathbed important enough to risk losing me? Paul stood perfectly still. He looked at the altar, at the wedding ring still resting in its box, at Elsie. And then he spoke the words that changed the entire meaning of everything that had happened that morning. Because the last thing Grace ever asked of me was not to remember her. He struggled to continue. She asked me never to tell another woman what she made me promise. The church fell into stunned silence. Elsie stared at him. She did not speak for a long moment. Then, if you couldn't tell me because of a promise, how did someone else know enough to write that letter? Paul exhaled slowly. He looked around the sanctuary. There was no short answer. He placed the wedding ring on the altar. Not in surrender, but because for the first time that morning, he understood that what needed to happen had to happen before any ring was placed on any finger. He looked at Elsie. You know that I lost my parents when I was young. Yes, what I never told you was what that did to me. For years afterward, I lived inside a very small life. I worked. I came home. I kept everything manageable because manageable meant safe. I told myself that the smaller the life, the fewer the goodbyes. He paused. Then I walked into a bookstore one afternoon looking for a travel guide and grabbed the wrong shelf and spent 5 minutes reading a cookbook before I realized my mistake. A quiet ripple of surprised laughter moved through the pews. A woman was standing nearby when it happened. Instead of pretending she hadn't seen it, she walked over and said, very seriously, "If you cook the way you shop, I feel genuinely sorry for your future family." The laughter in the room widened slightly, the kind that arrives in the middle of sorrow and makes people feel briefly guilty for being grateful for it. I should have been embarrassed. Instead, I laughed. A real, full, unguarded laugh. The first one I had had in months. He looked down. That is how it started. Not with a grand moment. Not with a story worth telling at a wedding. Just two ordinary people on a completely ordinary afternoon. He paused again. We were married 3 years later. They were not perfect years. She always refolded towels after I had already folded them, which I found extremely difficult to accept gracefully. She insisted that every road trip required music. I preferred silence. We teased each other constantly. He smiled at something only he could see. We were genuinely, completely happy. Then the smile disappeared. 5 years after we married, Grace became sick. It started with exhaustion, the kind that doesn't lift no matter how much you sleep. We thought she was overworking. Then came the tests, the hospital visits, the waiting. The day we received the diagnosis, she spent the entire drive home holding my hand and telling me that everything was going to be all right, in the way that people do when they are not certain it is, but they need the person beside them to be able to keep moving. His voice grew quieter. We fought it together for almost 2 years. There were good stretches. There were terrible ones. Through all of it, she kept smiling. She never wanted anyone to carry her pain. That was who Grace was. She would absorb suffering to keep the people she loved from feeling it. Nathan quietly lowered his head. He had never known any of this. Not because Paul hadn't trusted him, but because Paul had buried this chapter so completely that even the people closest to him had been kept outside it. The night before she died, the doctors told us we were close. She asked everyone to leave the room. The church held its breath. I thought she was going to say goodbye. Instead, she asked me for a promise. Paul closed his eyes for a moment. She held my hand and looked at me and said, "Promise me that no woman will ever spend her life wondering whether she is competing with my memory." He swallowed. Then she said, "If you ever love again, and I want you to love again, don't let my name become the reason another woman feels she will always come second." Tears moved slowly down his face. Then she said, "Love her completely. Not beside me, not after me. Simply love her with the whole of what you have." He opened his eyes and looked directly at Elsie. That was the promise, to love the next woman I loved, fully, without reservation, without her ever having to wonder. He lowered his head, but after Grace was gone, I stopped hearing what she had actually asked me. I only heard my own fear. I convinced myself that to honor her wish, I had to erase her. I buried every photograph. I stopped saying her name. I avoided the places we had been together. I told myself that silence was the same as moving forward. He looked at Elsie steadily. It wasn't. Elsie looked at him through her own tears. "Oh, Paul," she said it quietly, "the way you say something when the full weight of a misunderstanding finally settles. You thought Grace was asking you to forget her. I know that now." She stepped closer. "She was asking you to be free. She was trying, from a hospital bed on the last night of her life, to give you permission to live without carrying her like a weight, and you turned that permission into another form of imprisonment." Paul closed his eyes. "Yes." Pastor Matthew stepped forward. "There is one more thing." He reached into the envelope a final time. He produced a smaller folded piece of paper, tucked carefully behind the anonymous letter, and held it out toward Paul. "This was not written by Hannah. I believe it belongs to you." Paul looked at the handwriting on the outside of the fold. He recognized it instantly. His hands began to tremble. "I thought this was gone." His voice was barely a sound. Elsie watched him. "What is it?" He stared at the paper for a moment before answering. "When Grace became ill, she started writing notes. Small ones, on whatever paper was nearby. She would hide them in places she knew I would find eventually. Inside jacket pockets, between the pages of books I hadn't opened yet, tucked into things I would reach for months later. So that long after she was gone, when I was just living and not thinking about loss, I would reach for something ordinary and find a piece of her still waiting." He unfolded the page very carefully. The ink had faded slightly with time. The handwriting was unmistakable. He stared at it for several long seconds. Then he read it aloud. His voice was unsteady, but it held. "If you are reading this, then you have finally learned that life kept moving." A sound came from somewhere in the congregation. Quiet, involuntary, the kind that escapes before a person realizes it has. "I hope you have stopped feeling guilty for smiling." He steadied himself. "And if someone wonderful has found her way into your heart, please do not spend your life protecting her from me." His voice broke for a moment, and then recovered. "Tell her about me. Tell her I loved terrible road trip songs. Tell her I always burned the pancakes." Soft laughter moved through the room alongside tears. The particular combination that belongs to moments when something heartbreaking manages to be beautiful at the same time. "Tell her that I loved you enough to pray that one day she would love you too." He paused. "Because love is not divided." He lowered the letter. "It is multiplied." No one moved. No one spoke. Every person in that church now understood the full, devastating truth of what they had been witnessing. Paul had not been honoring Grace's wish. He had been carrying a version of grief that Grace herself, from her hospital bed, on the last night of her life, had been trying to free him from. He had spent years protecting a promise that the person who made him promise it had never intended the way he kept it. Elsie walked toward him. She stopped close enough that only a few inches separated them. And she gently took his hand. Not because everything had been repaired, not because trust had returned in an instant, but because she finally, completely, understood the man she was standing beside. She looked into his eyes. "Can you make me one promise? A real one? One that belongs to us and no one else?" Paul looked at their hands. "What promise?" "Promise me that from this moment forward you will never again decide for me what truth I am capable of handling." The words settled into him like something coming to rest. "I promise." Elsie held his gaze. "No." He looked confused. She gave him a quiet, careful smile. Don't answer too quickly. Today has taught me something. Promises deserve time. She looked toward the altar. Kindness without honesty eventually becomes loneliness. You carried all of this alone because you believed that was kinder. But what it built between us was a wall I didn't know existed. In a house I thought I knew every room of. Paul lowered his head. I know that now. Nathan stepped forward. He looked at Paul with the expression of a man who has just been handed a version of a story he thought he already knew, and found it completely unrecognizable. I have been beside you for almost 10 years. I was there when your mother passed. I helped you move house twice. I have been at every birthday and sat with you through the hard seasons. I have never once asked you a question you didn't want to answer. Paul looked at his oldest friend. Nathan's voice was not accusing. It was grieving. How heavy must it have been, carrying all of that alone? Paul met his eyes. So heavy that after a while I forgot what it felt like to live without it. Pastor Matthew spoke quietly. That is what hidden grief does. It convinces us that carrying pain alone is strength. When the truth, the far more difficult truth, is that the strongest thing a person can do is allow someone to stand beside them in it. Elsie's father rose from the front pew. He had remained perfectly still throughout everything that had unfolded, not because he had nothing to say, but because he believed this conversation belonged first to Paul and Elsie, and it was not his place until he had something necessary to offer. He walked to the front and looked at Paul for a long, steady moment. When you came to me and asked for my daughter's hand, you looked me in the eye and I looked back and I told myself I could see what kind of man you were. Paul was very still. I know more about you now than I did yesterday, the older man said. I know you are capable of loving deeply. I know you are capable of grief that does not announce itself, and I know you are capable of making a mistake that costs you something significant. He held Paul's gaze. Mistakes and character are not the same thing. My concern has never been whether you have failed. It is whether you are capable of learning. Paul answered without hesitation, I am. The older man nodded slowly. I believe you. He looked at Elsie. But this decision belongs to my daughter and to her alone. Not to me, not to anyone else in this room. He stepped back. Elsie stood quietly. She walked to the altar. She picked up the wedding ring. She held it in her open palm and looked at it for a long time. It was beautiful. She had looked at it many times in the months since Paul first showed it to her. She held it now and thought about what it represented. A commitment, a faithfulness, the decision to arrive at the same person every morning and choose them again. She looked at Paul. Do you know what hurts the most? He waited. I spent months preparing to become your wife. I read about marriage, I prayed for us. I imagined growing old with you in small, ordinary, specific ways. The kind no one talks about, but that matter more than anything. Which side of the bed you'd always leave for me. Whether you'd be the one to make coffee on Sunday mornings. What it would sound like to have someone call me yours. She paused. And not once, in all of that imagining, did I picture spending my wedding day meeting the woman who shaped you into the man I fell in love with. She looked down at Grace's photograph, still visible at the edge of the envelope. I wish I had known her. Paul's voice was barely there. I think she would have liked you. Elsie smiled faintly. From everything I heard today, she was trying to give you permission to have exactly this, a future, a real one. She was trying to free you, Paul, and somehow you turned her gift into another form of silence. He nodded. I know. She looked at him directly. I am not afraid of your past anymore. I am not standing here resenting a woman I never met. Grace loved you. She loved you enough that her final conscious act was to try to make sure you could love again without guilt. She set the ring back in its box. But I am afraid of making a tomorrow decision inside a today that is still shifting under my feet. Paul nodded slowly. I understand. She took one careful step backward. So I am asking you not to marry me today. The sanctuary fell into a silence that felt like a collective exhale. Not because anyone felt defeated, but because everyone in that room understood exactly what she was doing. She was not walking away from Paul. She was walking toward a version of their future that had been built on something solid enough to last. She was refusing to let one of the most important decisions of her life be made in the middle of an earthquake. Pastor Matthew looked at the two of them with an expression that had changed since the ceremony began. Relief. Quiet, genuine relief. For the first time since he had opened that envelope in his office, he allowed himself to believe that stopping this wedding had not destroyed something beautiful. It had protected it long enough for it to become what it was always meant to be. Paul looked at Elsie. He said the only thing left to say. I will wait. 6 months passed. The church returned to its regular rhythms. Sunday services arrived and departed. Children filled the corridors. New families joined. Life moved forward in the way life always moves, patient and steady and full of its own quiet business, regardless of the unfinished stories people are still carrying inside it. But no one who had been inside that sanctuary on that Saturday morning ever quite forgot what they had witnessed. At first, the conversation in the weeks that followed was about the slap. Some people believed the pastor had gone too far. Others believed he had done the only truly honest thing available to him in that moment. The debate traveled through the congregation and beyond it, into dinner-table conversations and late-night messages between friends who had been there and friends who had only heard about it secondhand. Then something shifted. People stopped talking about the slap and started talking about the lesson underneath it. More than one engaged couple quietly approached Pastor Matthew in the months that followed and asked for extended premarital counseling, not because they were afraid of anything specific, but because one interrupted ceremony had reminded everyone who had been present that honesty is always more manageable before vows than after them. Several husbands admitted truths they had been carrying for years. Several wives confessed fears they had never found language for. Not because anyone had told them to, but because they had watched what the weight of a hidden truth can do when it finally chooses to arrive. And they had decided they would rather speak theirs at a kitchen table than at an altar. Whenever anyone asked Pastor Matthew whether he regretted what he had done, his answer was always the same. I didn't stop a marriage. I stopped a moment. And sometimes protecting a lifetime requires delaying a single day. Those words traveled further than he expected. Paul kept every promise he made in that sanctuary. He waited. He never called Elsie to ask when she would be ready. He never reached out to her friends looking for information about how she was thinking. He never sent long explanatory messages asking her to reconsider the timeline. He had said he would wait. And waiting, he discovered, was not a passive thing. It required discipline. It required trusting someone with a decision that affected him completely while accepting that the decision was not his to make. But it also gave him something he had not expected. Time. For the first time in years, he found himself living in a way that was not organized around a secret. For the first time in years, Grace's photographs came down from wherever he had hidden them and returned to the shelves inside his home. Not as a shrine, not as a statement, simply as part of his story. When visitors came and asked about the woman in the pictures, he answered. When someone said Grace's name, he smiled. He told the stories he had kept hidden for so long. The bookstore, the burned pancakes, the camping trip, the road trip playlists that were genuinely terrible and that he had secretly loved. And every time he spoke about her, he noticed something he had not expected. The telling did not open a wound, it closed one. Remembering Grace honestly did not prevent him from living, it made life feel more whole. One quiet Saturday morning, Paul drove to the place where Grace was buried. He carried no flowers. She had always preferred wildflowers growing naturally over cut bouquets that would be brown within a week. He sat on the bench nearby. He said nothing for a long time. Then he smiled. I understand now. A light wind moved through the trees at the edge of the cemetery. I thought I was protecting your memory, but I wasn't. I was protecting my fear. Fear of being fully known. Fear of someone seeing the whole picture and deciding it was too much to stand beside. He looked at the engraved stone. You tried to free me, and I turned your gift into another kind of silence. He sat quietly for a moment more. Thank you, for loving me enough to want me to love again. He stood. He walked back to the car. No speeches, no grand gestures, only peace. The particular, difficult peace that comes not from the absence of pain, but from the end of a very long argument with it. 1 week later, There was a knock at his door. He opened it. Elsie was standing on the step. She was not dressed for an occasion. She was dressed for a Saturday morning visit, the kind between people who have been through something together and have not yet decided what comes next. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then she looked at him and said, "You still make the coffee too strong?" He laughed, genuinely, cleanly, without effort. "I've been told that hasn't improved. I brought pastries." She lifted the small paper bag. I remembered. He stepped back from the door. "Come in." The conversation that followed lasted nearly 3 hours. They did not begin with the wedding. They talked about ordinary things: work, family, books, the neighbor whose dog still barked every morning with the enthusiasm of an animal encountering the concept of mourning for the first time. It felt like rediscovering something that had been misplaced. Not lost, only misplaced. Eventually, Elsie's eyes moved to the bookshelf. She saw Grace's photograph standing there. She walked toward it. She picked up the frame. She looked at it in the particular, careful way of someone who is deciding something. "So, these are the famous pancakes?" Paul laughed. "No, that was the camping trip. The pancakes never survived long enough to be photographed." She smiled. "I would have liked her. I think she would have liked you too." Elsie returned the photograph to exactly where she had found it. Not to be polite, but because she understood something that she could not quite have put into words yet, that love does not erase the people who helped shape us. It teaches us how to carry them honestly. She turned back toward Paul. "I came today because I finally have the answer." He waited. "When I left the church 6 months ago, I was not asking myself whether I loved you. I already knew I did. I was asking whether I could trust you again." She held his gaze. "I couldn't answer that in a day or a week. I needed time to see whether the man who finally told the truth in front of 200 people was the same man who would still be standing in this room 6 months later. Not performing honesty, but actually living it." She looked around the room, the photographs, the stories, the peace that's in this room that wasn't there before. She looked at him. "You kept your promise." "I tried." "No." She shook her head gently. "You did." She reached into her bag and produced a small white envelope. Paul looked at it with an expression that was one part apprehension and one part something that had been waiting 6 months to arrive. "I don't think I'll ever be comfortable with envelopes," he said. She laughed. "I know, I won't apologize." He opened it. Inside was a single handwritten card. It read, "Dear Paul, if we are ever going to build a marriage, let it begin the only way it should have, with nothing hidden. If you are still willing, meet me at the church next Saturday. Not because we have forgotten what happened there, because we have learned from it." Paul read it twice, then looked up. Elsie smiled through tears. "Would you like to try again?" He could not speak for a long moment. Then he nodded. Yes, the strongest promise made that day was not the one spoken aloud. It was the one they had already lived, in the 6 months between a wedding that had stopped and a marriage that could finally begin. In the patience, the honesty, the willingness to wait for something worth waiting for. Perhaps that is the quiet truth every marriage deserves to carry. Love does not ask us to arrive with a perfect past. It asks us to arrive with an honest heart. The hardest truth spoken before a wedding is almost always the very reason the marriage can last long after the celebration has ended. Grace knew that. She had known it well enough to try to give Paul permission, from a hospital bed on the last night of her life, to live without the weight of her. And in the end, the woman Paul had loved and lost became the reason the woman he chose to spend his life with finally received the whole truth of the man she was marrying. Some stories do not end at the altar. Some begin there. The real ones, the ones built on honesty instead of performance, on trust instead of silence, on the courage to be fully known by the person standing beside you, those ones always do. And if this story moved something in you today, if you have ever loved someone who kept something hidden or been the one who stayed silent when you should have spoken, then you already know exactly what this story is really about. It is not about a slap. It is not about a wedding that stopped. It is about the extraordinary, terrifying, life-changing courage it takes to be completely honest with the person you love most. And what becomes possible? What truly becomes possible when you finally are.